Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
What if we operated under the premise that everything is urbanism? And if so, then the city is no longer a bounded object, but a condition that extends across all systems of life. What was once considered external to architecture, climate, ecology, infrastructure, data, logistics, finance, and even human behaviour, now actively produces urban form itself. In this expanded paradigm, architecture is no longer limited to buildings or even districts, but it is drawn into modelling, simulating, and speculating on entire worlds. Density becomes a question of planetary capacity. Infrastructure becomes culture. The ground gives way to volumetric space. And distinctions between nature, technology, and urbanism begin to dissolve into hybrid systems of operation and life. In this episode, we explore how design becomes a way of testing the limits of the systems themselves. From data-driven cities and speculative megastructures to ecological integration and atmospheric urbanism, where architecture becomes a tool for rethinking the totality of urban life. And if urbanism is truly everything, a more complex tension emerges. When architecture is capable of modeling the entire system, what falls outside its frame? And what does it mean to design in a world where nothing is no longer external to the city? To lead us through this discussion, we are joined by Winy Maas, one of the most influential architectural thinkers and practitioners of the contemporary era. Across several decades, Maas has helped redefine what architecture can do and what it can speak about. His work has consistently explored the shifting relationships between design and society, between buildings and politics, cities and economies, space and capital, architecture and ecology, and increasingly, the role of information, data, and technology in shaping the urban future. As co-founder and the M of MVRDV, Maas has led a practice whose projects have become a global reference point, not only as iconic works of architecture, but as sharp commentaries on how the world operates. From Markthal in Rotterdam to Tianjin Binhai Library in China, Villa VPRO in Hilversum, Mirador in Madrid, the Sky Gardens in Seoul, and of course the canonical Dutch Pavilion for the Expo 2000 in Hanover. These works reveal global transformation in density, logistics, consumption, agriculture, housing, and governance. They often expose dynamic contradictions with humour, optimism, and playfulness, using architecture as both instrument and critique. Alongside MVRDV, Maas also founded the Y Factory, a globally recognized research laboratory dedicated to imagining future cities. The Y Factory investigates how urban life may evolve under pressures of climate change, migration, automation, inequality, and new technologies. Through books, exhibitions, simulations, and speculative design projects, such as the Green Dream, the Vertical Village, Porosity, WeGo, and numerous future mobility and density studies, it asks not simply what cities are, but what they could become. What makes Maas especially significant is the cyclical loop he has built between research, speculation, and practice. Ideas tested in academic studios and experimental projects often become built realities. Built projects in turn generate new questions for research. It is a model where architecture moves fluidly between virtual space and the construction side, between provocation and implementation, between imagination and delivery. In a time when cities face enormous uncertainty, Winy Maas offers a rare model of practice, bold, propositional, data-driven, politically aware, and unafraid to imagine ideas ahead of their time, while still finding ways to land them in the real world. Today, we're excited to explore that journey. Another recent project I didn't mention earlier is Sky City, which is developed through the Y Factory. Winy and I are currently leading the Sky City studio at RMIT University in Melbourne with Leo Stuckart and Alex Mures, which we will also touch on in today's discussion. It's a rare privilege to be working with Winy on this project. So Winy, welcome to Melbourne and to the Super Urban podcast, and thank you for joining this conversation. So Winy, I'd like to start with your editorial agenda when you guest edited Domus in 2019. Over that period of a year, you made a striking proposition: everything is urbanism. And this had a particularly interesting timing because it came just before the global pandemic. And that framing now, I guess, reads almost anticipatory. You were suggesting that urbanism was already no longer confined to planning, zoning, or architectural form, but had become, I guess, a kind of total condition. So climate systems, food production, even migration flows and digital infrastructures. Perhaps I could even add questions of supply chains, finance, and everyday behavior were now all operating as forces that were actively producing the city itself. And this expands urbanism from a discipline into a field of operations. One could even argue that they're planetary operations. And here the city is no longer bounded, but an open system of independent logics. So I guess here I'm curious, if everything is urbanism, what does that do to the role of the architect? And are we still primarily designing buildings, spaces, or are we now operating as coordinators of distributed systems that extend far beyond the discipline?
Well, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting. Good to make podcasts that create a kind of oral history through the architects that come here, and that you stage that, and so all the things that you cannot tell in a lecture can happen in such a kind of podcast. And I still enjoy the moment, that year of Domus, and there are a couple of reactions to that that I would like to address. The first is indeed this idea, which came out of the request of the Domus, company, of having me as one of the first guest editors, and Stefano Boeri was just the only one before, and then now they roll out a kind of complete ensemble. That was also the idea, and I think that was a kind of good idea to make a kind of to give a voice, or to stage a voice. But what I thought was that at that moment were two things. One is what you say, that I wanted to address the bigger scale of architecture. I mean, I was especially in Italy, and I was annoyed about the kind of introspection that architects have. They make an object, they say, yeah, it's beautiful, and that's it. And there is, and that it has actually not so much relationship. It has to the world, to the wider world. Probably it intervenes a little bit on a site. That is then what it did at its best. But urbanism is more than that direct localization. It is also what that localization, what that position does to the wider world, and what and how can the building then relate maybe between itself and not only the community that surrounds it, but even further away, because that community is also probably different than another community, and it can then therefore stage something else. So how to address that? In a magazine so we designed a kind of space, and I explained that I think in the first and in the last one, where we interviewed and showed projects and artists and on the bigger subjects of the world, and how that is then localized, how people react on that, and so it was and it ended up with a map where all these things were happening, and a calculation how much it contributed a little bit to an agenda or to agendas on a bigger scale. Call it climate change, call it temperature drop, call it water. So for me, it was a good year then to use all these voices to understand also the bigger picture better, and what we all could do to address that, and to use that platform. I mean, it's about 1,200 pages or something like that. How to, in the year, to cover that with this through the months. I saw it also as a kind of free fall into actuality, so that because that's what I love in magazines, that it's always updated and updating, and that is more than others. Many others do thematical choices, which I thought, boring. I want to play now for this 10 months. It's basically what you can do in this 10 months with the actuality, and see that from and use it almost as a newspaper to that give me info and to react also directly. And I did that. So the second thought, what I just described, so urbanism is deemed to be slow, according to many. So it takes 14 years to build up a neighborhood, or it takes maybe 50 years to build up a big city quarter to do that. So many people get bored. The urbanism is, what is it? It's not so sexy, and so architects, they love it because they can glamour, and they have a building done in 7 years' time. So urbanists have trouble. They have to speak, and their speech comes then along. But it's hard to show that over time. So it was also an attempt for me to make it more sexy and to attract thinkers, makers into that realm, because we need it. Because actually, it's much more important than these small, cute things that are there. So there's kind of the architecture is overrated. And that I also wanted to address in that year. So that came together in that word. Everything is urbanism. The funny thing, what happened afterwards? So you asked me the question, what happened before? And with this my annoyance on architecture and this micro management, and that. Afterwards, the thinking continued in two steps. 2019 became 2020, COVID came, and climate crisis became bigger. The role of outside spaces became much more important, public spaces became more important. And that led also to an advocacy afterwards to everything is actually landscape. And that is, so to stress also the role of buildings to participate on oxygen, on all the climatic responses more actively, and ultimately we paint a new landscape out of that, where plants and animals take a role in that. So we see it as a habitat where we live together, not only with ourselves.
I think here there's a really interesting sort of segue into one of the other sort of points you've been making more recently, which is everybody is urbanism. And I think it's led to the questioning of the discussion of the biotopias. And this sort of connects a recurring proposition in the work, both with the Y Factory and MVRDV, is that urbanism is no longer separate from life, from nature or the body. And under this sort of idea of everybody's urbanism, the city becomes almost a kind of ecosystem where heritage, biodiversity, infrastructure, and even, I guess, human biology are kind of networked systems to get thought about as being connected. And the concept of the biotopia, which you frame as a sort of future condition where buildings are not only embedded in nature, but actively operate as living adaptive systems that host and produce biodiversity. And if urbanism operates through bodies, ecosystems, and biological processes as much as the buildings and infrastructures, how realistic do you think this ambition is of a biotopia? And how could it integrate architecture, nature, and urban systems that fully merge into a living city?
So that's actually a next step. And then ultimately, maybe because I don't know if the word ultimately exists, but the next step afterwards, so a couple of years later, when we were researching at the Y Factory more on like innovation in materials, like also at RMIT is happening. And then you see that with then the influence of recycling, for instance, and that we are looking for like products and materials that self-recycle, can be used better and better. Actually, I could say there's a new era coming up where biology is the whole manipulation of biology. Ultimately, for the moment, I use that word because that can be also technobiology, and that is appearing in the architectural realm. So that's funny, because we started with everything is architecture. That was before me. Then we went through our everything is urbanism in Domus. We continued with around COVID with everything is landscape, and we sublimized now in everything is nature, where artificial nature, where not natural nature mimicry, but the role of time, the role of integration, recycling is should become our new nature, a new way of dealing with it, and their buildings play a role in it. But and what we try to do now is to culminate that in, I call it Biotopia, but in like a painting, if we speculate it to the max. That's a tradition I normally do, like do it to the max, because the max is of that period. We cannot go beyond, because we are hooked by zeitgeist, by technical constraints, by thinking constraints, philosophical constraints. And that is, so if you do speculate that to the max, then you get indeed like an utopia that is self-generating on the spot. It's behaving like nature. And that can go through different, say, materials that work together, that love each other, that combine all kind of parameters and properties that we wish, or that nature wishes, or that animals wish, and optimize that relationship. And we try to provoke in that way, in this Biotopia research, that we could do it even instantly. So not only in longer term, because in the ecological world, we talk now about the ecological footprint, about like lifespan, and concrete can take maybe hundreds of years of lifespan, and so it is. But if you can do it also instantly, so that we can change that while we're doing, and that's a beauty on itself. This everything is nature, that we try to see. And is it then finished? The word ultimate? No, our studio, what we do now here, is about Sky City. So where everything is flying is like the next step that we could do. So the word everything helps, because the word everything means that it is inclusive, and could have been everybody. You can be every. I learned that from the any conference times when a while ago with Rem and with Eisenman, how they were. So and I could replace that by every, and that is from any to every, and that is so. It has also, maybe that is the background of your question. Yeah. So beautiful question. Took me maybe long to respond, but
no, I think it's really good to understand, I guess, the kind of lineage of it, and it did lead to another point I wanted to discuss with you, and this sort of is also the subject of your lecture about biotopias, and I think it's a good way to kind of read the time parameters, because you talked about how architecture might be 5 to 7 years, and then urbanism might be 15 years, and now even those parameters, when you start talking about biology, they can be at either end of the scale. Some things happen incredibly quickly, and some things take decades, if not centuries, to kind of enact. Yeah. And
so it spans then in these also from XXS to XXL.
Absolutely,
also there, it's
the size,
follow up on the Book of Rem,
exactly, to do like 2 separate volumes on either side of it. And I was also recognizing for me, the interesting thing was also how you describe that idea of how the body biology and the kind of ecological exist within both the research that you undertake, but also how it manifests into the projects. And maybe there's examples where something is researched for a number of years, and then maybe parts of that get implemented later, which I think was really interesting, especially in the projects in Korea and so on. I was also thinking there that from your perspective, how we recognize that this is a necessary thing to kind of understand, like how we integrate biology into architecture. How realistic is it for a practice to be able to do that, and what are some of the challenges you face? Yeah.
Well, universities start, I think, also with a couple of roles. So they have more roles. Let me say, on one hand, they teach students a practice. On the other hand, they have to research. Research in a public realm is about things that we don't know yet. So for me, it's important to be part of universities, of that system, because I can do things that I cannot do in the practice. So that's one. So and I love that speculative part, and especially done not in a PhD world, a little bit, but mostly in a master's education, because that's the quickest, and to paint that suggestions. So per definition, there is a gap between research and practice. But that doesn't mean that there are a couple of things that we already can start to test in our practice. So I always say that, I said it in the lecture also, that I don't want to ask students to make an opera building that I'm doing at that moment in Chengdu, to do that also so that I can learn from them or pick ideas. Then that is not but because I want to do something which is indeed unexplored in the universities. But I know that it inspires, or that I steal ideas that come out of it, and that you find ways in the practice to do that. So, like parallel now, there are projects that participate in this sequence of research. In this, if I make a book on plants, or in the realm of everything is nature, then yes, I insist to make also buildings that do that and that carry them. And that they go through the processes of maintenance, go through the processes of the making of it, go through the processes of the calculation of carbon involved, because it's heavier, and to try to respond to that. So I think the beauty of having the potential to do the parallel reality check is that you can there also explore, and that it feeds back to the research agenda. So at the moment that we were confronted with that, nice to put plants on it, but it costs more concrete, and then we had to research and invent not only the carbon confessions and the carbon calculator, but also new calculators that are needed, that also show that are needed to compensate also the limitation of the carbon calculator only. So it's a good ping pong game between the two that I try to show in the lecture, and also in a book that I hope to make soon. And I'm very happy to have that to have created that ensemble, that this kind of. I was not the first. I think OMIA did it very smart by making AMO as a kind of mirror figure to do that. But that was very based in commercial practice still. So what I try to do with the Y Factory is then be embedded in the public world with all its consequences, and then but that gives also more budget. I can also I can work longer on it. I can access grants that for commercial firms are impossible to relate to, and that is that was the choice, to give it another name, also that part. So the MVRDV was born as a collective. The Y Factory is indeed the questionnaire, the one that puts the questions in it. And some people have been saying, yeah, but you should be from the Y Factory, it should be turn into the How Factory. And maybe then I have to rename MVRDV to turn that into the How Factory. And then, because the why question remains an incredible source. And it was an intuition maybe, but I see it as an endless chain of questions that you can produce that deepens also the aspects of research. Every time you find more whyness in this development, so that explains a bit the combination.
Because I was thinking, not just recently, but a while ago, thinking the same thing around, how do you decide if it's a why or a when or a how? And but the more I thought about it, the more I kind of realized that the why works like a vector. Like it can actually go in any direction you want it to go. So you could apply that as a vector and say, ask the question and then trace the roots of the problem. But you could also ask the question and find 20 ways of dealing with it in the future. So I think it gives it a lot of agency, I think, to be able to ask that question at that scale. And then it brings a whole new range of systems into view, depending on what the question is. So if it's about, mobility, it brings infrastructural questions. If it's about the environment, it brings biological and ecological questions. So I think it's a really great platform to be able to kind of connect those ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful way of saying. You have a perfect Melbourne way of explaining this. You use the word systems 5 times, and to address that, you use the word platform and you use the word agents. So that, which is now teaching here, or teaching already for a while, is probably the highest ranked words of your glossary. So that's it amuses me. But you're right. Because sometimes it annoyed me. There's these words like systems, like you kill all the depth into a kind of ultimate word, and but it does. but it also gives it a kind of overview.
It's actually funny that you mentioned that. I actually have glossaries that have turned into projects themselves. You've got to call it something for it to exist. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that at some point. But I think also just going back to this question of how you approach these questions, and whether you're describing it through counterfactual or by describing it as everything is. It also reminded me of some of my very early interests in your work has been through books like Metacity, Datatown. It's been the 5-Minute City. It's it's been a collection of these things that even Skycar City, where you very early on asked those questions and then established a very clear way of working through those problems. So it was data, it was simulation, it was visualization of the data that led to something very kind of specific, and you were testing that out long before you could apply it directly into projects. But now we can see with that interval of time, the projects are. That almost is the starting point for many projects. Yeah. And I'm just curious about how you see that at the moment, given that there's like 20 or 30 years of testing that out, and whether that's now starting to become more based on digital twins or other such ideas, or whether they're still kind of something that architects explore from the ground up in a project.
That's a beautiful analysis of time. And I remember indeed also in the early years, the word datascape, that we use that on purpose to use architecture to visualize the limitations of our time, because you come always to frontiers, you come always to maximizations, because our bylaws, because of our economies, because of our building codes, etc. And by pushing that to the max, it questions then that law or that code. And because if we want to be more dense or be more radical, or we need to be there, then we have to change those bylaws. That's what it's, in short, that is, one can continue to apply that, but it has also some nuances, that thought. I think the word optimization came in. That's not a maximization, but that's which is a balance or temporary balance between extreme factors, between paradoxes that are in both in science as in the reality, and and that becomes then an instrument of participation. That becomes an instrument of temporariness, so time. Therefore, so that was born after that, to make nuances, and to make it to relate to processes, and not only into maximizations or to ultimate situations. I think over time we went also starting with, say, data, with initially statistics. Statistics was, I think the Dutch invented statistics to be used for urban planning, even more than later Chinese or Russian people would do. They were abusing it also, and later maybe Google is also abusing it these days. So we are, because that helps to explain the bigger role of architecture or of urbanism. There is a majority that does it, so in which is democratic. So there is if you have the bigger data, you can see how many of certain kind of lifestyles are involved or not, or how much people are really coming to this place or are going there. And so it gives a lot of space, statistics, to do that. But statistics have been developed over time. We have seen that currently, you mentioned already, the digital twin. And I think we were already very active. In the first book, we tried to work already on the word optimization, with the tools that were, the computational tools that were there, especially in MIT. We continue that for the regional planning. We design a platform in Spacefighter to make it more interactive and on the go, so to say. And we continued later, I think, also with loving scripting. So scripting, simply Grasshopper in combination with Rhino, and you do a kind of three-dimensional scripting, and to cover the complexities that are growing because of the growing technology, because of the growing participation and democracies, with the growing middle classes that want to speak out, with still in many places a growing need for buildings, and in other places a need of more nature. There's all kind of more research than has more data, and then the scripting helps to maneuver to that. One could say that is a kind of a primitive way of dealing with AI. That is, but also immediately saying that AI and scripting are actually not so related yet.
Yes.
When you compare to photoshopping, that's kind of the most advanced AI almost, or writing texts is those are the most used parts. So I still think, I mean, there is a lot of criticism on AI and also skepticism, or if not fear, and of losing jobs or losing control, and which I think could be, but that doesn't mean that we should not do it anymore, because it takes its own role already for a long time, for maybe 40, 50 years. And I'm also very guilty partly on that, because I already contributed in this sequence that I just painted, that it evolved from a kind of primitive and polemic debut or start to I think a much more richer and deeper and actually also more inclusive way of integration of this suggestion. And and that's not finished. That's so. But this explains, hopefully, your question how we went through over time, together with society, together with the rest of the world, and to stage that, how that you can see that in urbanism and in architecture, how that can be appearing. We need maybe a kind of historian or a post-historian to write this down.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important, recognition of the different tools, but also how they might be applied. And I think, part of the, at least the way I see it, part of the skepticism in AI, for instance, is also around the idea that many people see it as a disruptor, but also some people see it as a black box in which you can't really understand what's going on, and or you have limited control over it. But I was curious to ask you, when you did describe, a series of, how data can be utilized, but also how it can be abused as well. And I was wondering how you deal with those questions when you're looking at projects or the cities, because sometimes you find that, information can be used to reinforce, undesirable conditions, and sometimes it can be used to isolate those conditions and then learn from them and learn how to deal with them. So I was curious of how you apply those logics in projects.
Well, the first is that I think we were and are one of the first offices that did apply scripting in a much wider meaning, that we installed also a kind of department within our office called MVRDV Next to give that a place, and we somehow invested in that. And so we to show that we're very active with this matter. That's one, so that we also know more about complexity. Even we try to be a little bit advanced somehow in our own world. We try to beat the current AI by just being ahead because of the complexity that is there, and then I can build up a certain kind of trust or reference. So there's a truth which we made, and that is based on certain premises, and so that I can judge the spatial consequence a little bit better. That's one. Second element that we apply is the open sourcing. So for fact checking, I think open sourcing is the only way to go. That means that if we even invest in scripts, if we even make, for instance, the carbon calculations, calculator, then you can find it on our website, and it's an invitation to criticize it. Not that people, they do it sometimes through projects, they question certain data in it, and which is good, that's completely fine. But there you see the reference, so you can control us if that is what we need to do. And of course, people can hack, but that's also a very enclosed circuit to. So those are the two important roles that I see to deal with it. But I'm still also very attracted to go deeper into these complexities and this trying to be ahead. Because I will get older and my brains are maybe less good, but the company to find out what is needed more. And that is why I'm happy also to be here, because I think that RMIT has also quite a position in the world of being a laboratory, different than ETH and different than MIT. And that is, with your scripting, with your material research, you do quite, and that inspires me also. But also I can respond. So I'm happy this morning already when. With the printing of sand, the sand making, what you do pretty beautiful. Yeah, that I also try to do. We need a kind of mineral cycle to do that. So it gave immediately ideas for potential research, which cannot be done now here in RMIT because you don't have enough people, despite that you do already doing. But I can ask for finance from some clients to make that mini research. So everything is mini research. So you also a nice title to add that to my sequence, but add that also to your portfolio or to my portfolio. That's the beauty of dialectics. And from the very beginning, we were aware that I'm just a tiny architect. But that if you want to touch bigger agendas, you have to collaborate. And you have to, that you cannot do on your own.
Absolutely. I think what's quite radical in the approach is that, I think when you ask those new questions, you also seek new methods or techniques to engage with them. And I think that's also what builds the kind of discourse and builds the sort of impact that these projects have, because those tools might be then, applied elsewhere. And I think there's something, you use the word open source, which I think makes it really, available for other people to kind of engage with and better understand, their own sort of projects.
I think also the attitude that our architecture is actually very clear. We didn't deal with mystification. So we were more postmodern than the postmodernists, and they, in order to hate that, and that clarity is also a communicative vehicle. That is, this building is clearly says that or manifests that, and that was criticized maybe by some people that loved complexity, that like a building should look complex. But the message should be for everybody, no? That should be pop, or to address that. That doesn't mean that a one-liner can be boring for a building, can be shallow. So when you want to go back to a one-liner, so there's enough intricacy in it, there's enough depth in it, let me say that, so, because it's a concept. I always use the word conceptual architecture. So this concept is already bigger project than a literal project. That opens it up. That is in that way of making architecture, so that it becomes a messenger, but one that you start to have a relation with longer. And so it's a moment in time, for sure. You cannot, we always look back in 100 years to that pieces of architecture were made on that specific moment in time. That you cannot avoid, and I don't want to avoid either. But to exaggerate it, to prolong it, and to deepen it, and to show it also as a piece of criticism, and to ourselves, has proven also a way. When I try to translate this now, also why that is also a kind of open source. Why also that it became a kind of method that a wider generation is also using. I mean, there are quite some friends in that there is I don't say it's a new Siam. It's not. But on the other hand, you see the ping pong games between different practices on these subjects, and that you then also relate to that through your work. So I want to express that also. Otherwise, we stay in a conversation which is only about data or only about research. On the other hand, architecture is also like a petrified research, and it's like, and it wants to and should be communicative. That's why I like also. I mean, here in Melbourne, this whole precinct is a funny lab, not only inside the buildings, but also in the architecture. You make pixels that pop out. You make but you make also a building that is conceptually very interesting. The face of this activist that you can see from far on the axis, which I find a brilliant building and politically so touching that I also wanted to link up with them and made in Tirana the three-dimensional version of that. So there you can see the dialogue, I would say, with others that are, and I don't copy them. I copy hopefully right, or I copy further. So I develop is what I try to explore already in a book copy paste. That is taking place when you're sitting on the foot of that building. Yeah. So that is that touches me, and I want to convey that message also.
So I've been thinking about this point after your lecture last week, and it sort of brought back a lot of thoughts about the work of MVRDV, but also particularly the speculative projects that you do and the editorial work, where there is a persistent, I guess, undercurrent of mischief, playfulness, provocation, and perhaps even transgression. And these are not kind of stylistic gestures, but they're kind of methods, right? And they sort of they allow you to exaggerate urban logics, pushing systems to almost absurd limits, and bending categories such as nature, infrastructure, housing, and perhaps even data. And so here you can almost see how architecture would operate not only as a serious spatial practice, but also as, I guess, a sort of strategic irreverence, where humor becomes a way of exposing hidden assumptions within urban systems. So if mischief, playfulness, provocation, and transgression are part of the architectural toolkit, do they function as critical instruments that expose systemic limits, or as aesthetic strategies that risk, I guess, neutralizing their own political edge? And I think by extension here, I'm curious about whether you think architects take themselves too seriously.
Well, for sure, there's a bunch of architects and that never smile. And there are definitely architecture cultures where smiling is somehow forbidden. You can call it Germany, call it Switzerland, in a way, because it's also the Anglo-Saxon cultures. And when they allow for irony, then you get a kind of British irony, which is over the top, and is actually too jolly to take it serious. So it's a very subtle, and so there's one, but there's a very. It is in order to allow. I mean, I try to take it serious also. I'm also by being playful, or by being ironic or naughty. And I see it as indeed as a tool for criticism. You're completely right in that way. And to give that place, to petrify that also, that it becomes a point of reference. So that again, then you can always refer to that moment of naughtiness in history. That in order to going beyond the datascapes, naughtiness is needed to but it also, it has a combination of going beyond. On the other hand, it relativates. When I try to make the Germans now smile by our home buildings project in Mannheim, then it relativates that seriousness. You see also, come on, you kill yourself if everything is deadly serious. There's no space for guilty pleasures, why do you do it? Is also the question behind it. Is it so needed to be that strictness and to that seriousness in? Is that really so good? Is what it starts to ask, is that what people also want to see only? If that is our realm of the future? So that's the role. That these kind of thoughts are behind that. So it's behind that attitude. And that moment of naughtiness in a process, because it comes every time. So that's in every building. There's a moment, and you look into the eyes of the client, and then your eyes, they start to sparkle, and your lips start to smile up. Then a good client knows, that is the moment that you get criticism in it. So it was once I filmed in one interview by Dutch television where one person saw that also, that is happening, that moment. But that moment is a moment of liberation, is one. Suddenly all the things come into. It is also the ultimate moment of analysis. That is actually all the wires, all the small threads that come together in that moment of this twist. And so I see it actually as a kind of hyper analytical moment of escape and of putting things forward.
So, Winnie, I'd like to spend a few moments discussing the Sky City project with the Y Factory that we are currently working on in Melbourne. And this probably extends a much broader sort of arc of interest that could be traced back to this MVRDV sort of Sky Car project, but also a lineage within urban history and projecting on futures for cities. So cities have always been shaped by mobility systems that, right from roads to railways to ports, I guess even logistic corridors and aviation. And, each technological shift begins to reorganize not only movement, but urban form itself. It also impacts density and governance. So what is emerging now is an extension of this trajectory, volumetric, three-dimensional urban conditions. So the Sky City project is largely been sort of developed with the Y Factory. Sort of treats the sky not as empty space, but as an active urban layer. So here we imagine, a paradigm where a new formation of city is populated by drones, autonomous flight systems, and aerial logistical infrastructures. So the vertical dimension becomes operational rather than just sort of a background or rather than just being symbolic. So if cities have historically been organized through ground-based mobility systems, what fundamentally changes when mobility becomes volumetric and when the sky becomes a designed and contested urban space?
I think we came in our conversation already a little bit across. Everything can fly, or it's flying. There are a couple of, motives behind it. One is that it becomes a bit busy on this tiny planet. And you can do that by maybe going to the moon or to Mars. Some people are doing it. We can also use our sky for doing it. Second element is the climatic issue. It becomes too hot. So we are already abusing particles to protect ourselves from the sun. At a certain moment, we don't control it very well yet. We are also very afraid of that, despite the investments that it's gaining and the initiatives that are taking place. We are afraid of manipulating meteorology with the weather, etc. So there is something in the air. Secondly, the idea of already working on the sky starts with the planes, went over with the Jetsons to with like enthusiasm of dealing with sky cars at a certain moment, which are still I'm going more on the production, where even Mr. Muller somewhere next to Chicago started with such a thing already in the 70s when he etc. So there is a wish to master that. There is also a criticism. There's a danger. There's a fear on that, and so and in the meantime, now we come at a moment that we have more technology that is there already. I mean, cloud seeding is not yet there, although we try, and also in a biological way, more and more, and see attempts to do that. And I showed one film of this cloud seeding potential also. Maybe there are flying algae at a moment that do also something with the oxygen or with the water system that we can do. But in the meantime, there is a war, or a couple of wars are going on. The drones have entered our society in a kind of dangerous way also, and in an incredible speed. The drone is developed to attack us, but but also maybe to do something more. So in an attempt to study the civic aspects of these developments, we analyze the current state of the art of the drones. We try to give it more properties. We invent certain elements in this. We started 2 years ago with it, based in Prague University and an archive there. One of the elements that I was confronted with was the war, how to rebuild maybe Ukraine, but also all the drone factories that are in the eastern part of Europe, but now actually everywhere, to be honest. And we started to invent then possible thoughts. How can I make the drone so stable that it will not fall on top of a highway? So you make feedback loops in the drone itself. How can I make drones that can be stronger and that can carry more or lift more by grouping them? How can I have another kind of energy supply in them so that they can continue flying? How can I add maybe docking advice systems that then, and I'll use your word, that can group them. So besides flocking, they can also dock. So and then that opens. This is a sequence, and some of them are now built in these 2 years. The stack drone is there, built in Barcelona, in Catalonia, where you have now a stack of drones that do together. The clustering of 3 mini drones is now almost a tool. The mini parachutes, mini gliders, the energy swappers are there. So 2 years ago they were not there. So, but that opens up something. If I look from the civic side, because now I can send any package easily over the world, but people protest. They don't want to have it on top of their garden because they feel the privacy issue. So where to put them then? So you have to direct the drones now over existing streets, which was not allowed by law. So this mechanism, but if it falls, it doesn't fall on the street, but to a place where you would like to have it fall, is now technically doable. That changes our laws on this matter. To group these drones and to give kind of drone highways if we want to use them for our quick transport. We calculated also in one studio how much of the traffic I could replace by drones and how much kilometers of movement I reduce because it's straight, and it's and actually how much energy also I gain. But that's a contradiction because flying costs energy currently, and but driving around the corner costs also energy, especially if you do it with electric cars. So we did that comparisons to see is it an option to and then look further to the potentials that it has when you transport it. What are the patterns to do that? You could also use it for other things. I can make a farm in the sky. I group them. They have a kind of skin with air roots, and they come to you when it's needed, if it swaps around. Or I can make a curtain between them. I can span wires that could create shadow. I can even turn, ultimately, in a house where I need about 10,000 drones to construct a transformable house. And the house is what's funny, because these drones become ergonomic. They are there only a bed when they need to be a bed. Then they change it into a dining table, or they change it into, for the moment that it's there. And suddenly, a drone house, space-wise, is much more effective than our current construction techniques. So when does it then occur? At the moment that we need other kind of cities, that the programs continue, that we want to have deliveries, we want to have kind of supply chain through the air, and when more energy through the sky, more even certain programs in the sky. Then I thought, okay, let me try with students to think that we have a mirror city that flies, and how does it look like in 24 hours. How many people are? What's the density that can come across? What are these bees doing? How do they that are above us? Where can't they come? And how can you live with that? So it's a kind of maybe it's not the truth that is there. It's a potential. Maybe it's not a wish, but it's also a tool for students to explore urbanism, which is so free as ever before. It's not a blocks or grid action. It's free, directional. It is, and I think that students should master that because it's more fundamental ultimately. I mean that it distills into a grid, no problem, but that you are able as urbanists to think that a city adopts and adapts itself in seconds over time. It optimizes itself over time. I think that kind of knowledge is helpful to judge better our current cities or our future cities. So this kind of free urbanism is what we are testing as a kind of side effect of also those terrible components of the drones. But what if, in that way, this is an upbeat of a more biological or even chemical process in the sky, when we can really make clouds, then the mechanics of that cloud forming are revealed by this kind of research.
I mean, it is an absolutely fascinating project because I guess it sort of asks questions that go right to the core of architecture and urbanism, where through new forms of engagement, new tools, new technologies, and I guess new understandings of behavior and relationship, we have to adapt a lot of the systems that we're so familiar with to understand how the city might become a layered, perhaps even algorithmically governed volume. And so suddenly this device of the sky becomes itself a kind of infrastructure and a territory. And what we're advocating for in this instance is how might it potentially become the primary sort of site of future urban life. I think we probably need to schedule an entire discussion on this project as it sort of disrupts so many of the orthodoxies of the city and generally society itself. But we have to sprint across the city, unfortunately on foot, to see what our team has been up to with the Sky City project. But look, thank you very much, Winy, for joining us. It's always inspiring speaking to you. And and it's been a pleasure having you on the Super Urban podcast.
Thank you for your questions. Yes, maybe there's another moment soon to do part 2.
This conversation is a reflection on a very particular mode and I guess even model of design practice, one that compels a consistent expansion of what architecture can be asked to do and perhaps what urbanism can be understood to include. From systems of data and density to infrastructure, ecology, and even the atmosphere itself, the city is no longer a fixed object, but a continuously produced condition. So across the work of Winy Maas, through MVRDV and the Y Factory, we see a practice that is committed to pushing that expansion, to modeling, speculating, and building at the limits of what urbanism can contain. But as those limits dissolve, the questions become sharper rather than softer. When everything becomes urbanism, what is architecture no longer able to see, hold, or refuse? And in a fully designed world, what remains outside design? Winy, thank you for joining us on the Super Urban podcast, and thank you to our listeners. You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.